We're going to look at how to install a domain controller, how to build a domain controller. And we've got ourselves a 2019 VM that is built, a virtual machine that is built. You can do this on a physical or on a virtual machine. So we're assuming that you've already got a shell or a Windows Server 2019 box already built, ready to go. And we're going to deploy and build a domain controller onto it. So essentially install the tools, install the services, promote that server to a domain controller, and that way we can use Active Directory, which is really the whole point. And then once you've got the domain controller built and Active Directory configured and working well, have PCs and servers binding themselves to that domain controller so that you can use it in a fully functional domain. So what we're going to do is we're now going to cross over to my PC. I'm doing this from a Mac connected into a VMware console, and it's going to look really, really good, really, really easy to use. So let's just cross over to my Mac right now. Okay, so we are connected. Now, the first thing you need to go do is go and set yourself a static IP address and give a particular name that is relevant to what you want to call it. So from within the system area, I'm going to go and call this Win Server DC01. Okay, you'll obviously give it a name that is relevant for you, whatever your naming convention may be. And we're going to say, okay, we leave the domain blank because we're obviously creating a new domain here. Okay, so that's just what we're going to call it. It'll ask you for a restart now. So we'll do that in a second. Okay, then close. We'll restart later. And the second thing is to go and actually give it a static IP address. Now, the reason we want to do this is you should never really have a domain controller with a dynamic IP address, which is essentially an IP address that will change. You want it to be static so that it never changes. It's very important, especially for a domain controller. Just go and create a relevant IP address that is within your IP address range. All right. And we're going to give it a DNS in here. Okay. So that is now my static IP set. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go and restart. Now you will notice that in the bottom right hand corner here that I'm running a evaluation copy of Server 2019. That is fine for this demo. I can then go and license it later on. Of course, if you are going to be building this domain controller and you want to be using it permanently, perhaps in a production environment, you want to obviously have a key that is legitimate, right? You want to have it licensed via a volume license or even via a MSDN if you're going to be using it, say, in a developer network. Now we've got our server ready to go. It's got a name, it's got an IP address. The next step is to now go and install the actual domain controller services, which is the Active Directory tools and a few other things. So we want to go into Server Manager and we're going to say add roles and features. Okay, you can also do it via the top area right here. Clicking into manage, add roles and features really shows up to the same page. We're going to say role-based or feature-based installation, and we're going to be installing it on this particular computer. We're going to tick Active Directory domain services. This is going to install a number of different snap-ins and different tools to be able to install domain services that you're going to need. All right, so we're going to say add feature. So that's going to select domain services and everything within it, all right? Now, what I like to do is I generally like to have my domain controller to also act as a DNS server, but I like my domain controller to also be my DNS server. So we're going to be installing both the Active Directory domain services and DNS server. We'll leave file and storage services ticked for now. We can always remove that later if we so choose to. Under features, we're not going to touch anything here. Group policy is going to be installed. So group policy lets you obviously do a number of policies against computers, against servers, to be able to lock them down, add features, deploy software, things like this all remotely over the network. It does give me an option here around wanting to learn more about Azure Active Directory or Azure Active Directory. We're not going to be doing it in Active Directory, but the option is there. So click on next, next, okay. Let's restart automatically if it's required. Okay, so as soon as this is done and it's installed all of this, rather than it asking me, do I want to restart, I just ticked it to say that it will do it automatically for me. And if you're happy with all of that, we now click on install. This process may take a little bit of time. It really will vary on the speed of your server 2019 build, whether if it's physical, virtual, how much CPUs, how much RAM you've got. So we'll just check back once this is done. Installation is now completed, and in my case, it hasn't actually required a reboot, which is fine. Yours may have, which is fine. But now the next step is really now to create or promote this server into a domain controller. All it's got right now is the services, then the software to be able to make it into a domain controller. Right in here, you can click on promote this to a domain controller, which is excellent. If it's restarted, for example, and you're not in this section, the other way to do it is by clicking into the start menu and typing in DC promo, and then opening up that command right there. It's really exactly the same. So for us, we're just going to do it right in here because it has given me the option to promote this server to a domain controller. So here's a couple things. Add a domain controller to an existing domain, add a new domain to an existing forest, and add a new forest. Now, we're not going to go into too much detail, but essentially a forest is the very top level, and a forest contains one or more domains. So this is really asking you, do you want to create this domain controller and add it to an existing domain? Perhaps you've already got an existing domain and this is a new domain that you just want to have as a secondary or a tertiary domain controller. You can do that and just add it to an existing domain. You can then also add a brand new domain to an existing forest. So let's say you've got a forest, the top level, and you've got a domain already called, mybusiness.com. You can then create another domain called mybusiness2.com and add it under the same forest. That's also good. But for us, we're going to be creating a brand new domain. That's really the whole point of this, which is really creating a brand new forest, which is the top level. So we're creating the forest, and then the domain underneath it will have really the same name, and that is one domain within one forest. Now you have to go and give your root domain a name. It doesn't have to be unique in the sense that the internet can never have this. It's not like going and registering for a domain name for a website that has to be yours and yours alone. You can't have two that sort of exist on the internet. This is completely internal. It's internal to you. It's internal to your business, whatever you may be using this to create. So give this a meaningful name to be used internally. So for my demo, I'm going to just say it's a home demo.com. That is going to be the name of my domain. You, of course, give it your name that is relevant to you. It's now going to ask me for the forest and the domain functional level. So really what this means is the devices that are on your network, the servers that are on your network, need to be a particular Windows Server edition. So you'll see that by default, it's gone and said Windows Server 2016, but it's also got options of 2008 R2, 2012 and 2012 R2. So if you have a server that you're going to be binding into the domain, connecting into the domain, and it is not running 2016, but it's running, say, you've got a server that's running 2012 or 2008, you won't be able to connect that server into a domain or a forest that is in a higher functional level, okay? So let's say, for example, you've got some servers that already exist that are 2012. Go and set your forest and your domain functional level to 2012. Otherwise, you can't get them bound to this new domain. Specify domain name controller capability. So this is, do you want to have DNS, which we've said yes. Do you want it to be a global catalog so that it registers and has LDAP and other things around a global catalog? Yes, we do. Is it a read-only domain controller? Well, no, we don't need it to be read-only. We can leave that as is. Now here's something that's very important. Type in the directory services restore mode password, the DSRM. This is a very important password. Make this password complicated. Save this password in a secure location. You will need this for any form of restoration work that needs to be done on your domain controller. So make this something different to your administrator password for your actual domain controller itself. Specify DNS delegation options. We don't want to delegate DNS to anything, so we can just say next on there. Verify the NetBIOS name assigned to this domain and change it if necessary. So it's going to go and look for this. NetBIOS really isn't used too much unless you've got a lot of old systems and hardware on a network, but you've got certain limitations with using this, but automatically it's found home demo, which is fine, which is what we've allocated to the domain. So I can leave that as is. So in a lot of cases, you want to just leave these in the default location, the database folder, the log file folder, and the sysvol folder in the Windows folder. Some places that I've worked in the past like to have these in different folders, in a different drive, but we're going to leave those as the defaults. Bit of a summary on what you've selected. Okay, if you're all happy with that, you can then click on Next. So what this is going to do is it's now going to do some prerequisites. It will validate the server to make sure that it is compatible, that you can actually install the domain controller services and actually promote it as a DC. So you'll see at the very top, I've got a nice green tick. All prerequisite checks pass successfully. So I can click on Install to begin installation, but it has thrown up some warnings, okay? These may be relevant to you. These may not be relevant to you. So in my case, these are fine, okay? I'm not so concerned about these warnings because they're not going to prevent me from installing something. Now, if you're going to be installing the domain controller services, the DC promo with other particular services that are already on there, sometimes there are compatibility issues, and that is why you may actually fail the prerequisite. So my recommendation is have a server that is going to be dedicated for the domain controller. So if you're happy with that, we can now click on Install. It's throwing up some of those warnings again, just more notification warnings. And it's now starting to do all of the directory partitions and all the directory structure and everything that it needs to do. So let's just leave that and come back to it. So after the initial installation of those services, the server should restart. It may take a little bit of time to restart and do some basic configurations in the back end, but then you should be presented with this screen right here. Now you'll see that it's automatically picked up the domain name that we gave it, so home demo, and then administrator, which is my standard administrator password that I throw in here. And then once Server Manager opens, or you open it up manually, you'll see a few things in here. Under the local server setting, you'll see your computer name, which is great. You'll see your Ethernet IP address, which is now static IP, and you'll also see domain. And you'll see that it is listed here with homedemo.com, which is actually my domain name. So by promoting this server to a domain controller, it's automatically created the domain, as well as DNS, which it's also installed right here. So you can see that it is really now a domain controller. So there should now be Active Directory tools in here. You go into Windows Administrative Tools, you'll see that there is now a whole bunch of Active Directory tools. So the Administrative Center, which has a lot of cool stuff. But then of course, the most common ones being the domains and trusts, where you can go and configure the domains and trusts, like linking domains together, things like that. Sites and services, as well as your standard users and computers for you to be able to go and start creating your OU directory structure. You've got your domain controller listed in here. You've got computers, users. You can create a whole bunch of stuff. It does auto create a whole bunch of users right into here, essentially built-in users and security groups, which is excellent. And you can really now start using it. So as long as other servers and computers on your network can see this domain controller, you can now start binding computers to this new domain. So the same way that you would generally go into the system settings, computer name, and change, I'm going to say okay just for now, you can now go and bind it. You'll see that automatically it's got domain is homedemo.com, but you can now start to add computers, whether it be Windows servers, Windows clients, Mac, Linux computers. Obviously, there's things like DNS that needs to be configured properly. You want to make sure that your forward and your reverse lookups are configured, that you've got adequate network connectivity set up, for that your subnets are correct, that your firewall is configured correctly, that all of that traffic, all of the backend systems are communicating and can see each other. So we've really just touched on it from a very, very high level. We just created a basic domain controller with some of the basic services. Of course, Active Directory is a huge beast. There's a lot of stuff you can do. The domain controller services, you can do a lot more than what we covered today. This video won't go into detail about some of the other stuff, but you can go and investigate that and learn more about Active Directory as you need to. But they're the basic steps on how to create a domain controller. So they were the steps. Hopefully you were able to build your own 2019 server with a domain controller service fully running with a domain and Active Directory.